And last but not least, we have industrialization of Russia. So, after everyone else had kind of ditched the idea of an absolute monarch, Russia held on strong. Um, the state exercised great control over the people, way more than anywhere else in the Western world or Europe at this time. They didn't have a parliament, they didn't have political parties, they didn't have elections because they had an absolute monarch, which the rest of Europe had had for a long time. You still have a society that's, ruled by a, a king or a czar, but then also the nobility. I mean, it's still very feudalistic for the most part. And until the 1860s, you still had serfdom. So they're kind of the last ones hanging on, which just kind of puts them like behind the curve a bit, where the rest of Europe has already launched off from there and moved on. These guys are still hanging on to these old traditional ways, which I guess have worked for them for a long time. They're slow to change. So some pictures of lives of a Russian serf. They're peasants. They struggle. They're not treated well. I mean, these are the poorest of the poor in Russia. And it's crazy to think that, yeah, we have photographs of them. Because again, just like American slavery, wasn't that long ago. So the Industrial Revolution in Russia. They were a society of free farmer, or the sources of change in Europe are going to be free farmers, workers, businessmen who wanted new opportunities. The change in, so it's all like other people driven. It's just like naturally it occurs and there's a need for it because the populations dictate it to happen. Versus in Russia, it is going to be people like Peter the Great who say, no, we're doing this. It's not because the people are pushing for it. It's not a communal decision or naturally, organically happening. It is the government says it's going to happen. So we start with the freeing of the serfs because if we talk about wanting a modernized civilization, serfdom is not modern. It is very feudalistic. So therefore, we need to dump it in order to become this modern world, at least like start our journey down that path. They start becoming an industrial developed nation to some degree um, in the 1860s. I mean, they start down that path. They just, they're slower about it and they struggle more to get on their feet. So the thing is, they free all the serfs, which is great, but they don't reform any land or food. So, like the serfs now, they're not basically slaves, but they still don't have the right to own land, which could help them in life. They still don't have access to food for the most part. So, all of these things are really rough. They do have other reforms, though. The most notable is going to be the Trans Siberian Railway. So, with this Trans Siberian Railway, resources are available for it. It helps lead to settlements elsewhere. It's an example of industrialization and leads to more of it. So it's like the iconic mark of industrialization for Russia at this time. You also have foreign loans and tariffs. Like they're doing other things, but the problem is the peasants are still really unhappy. That is not fixed by any of these things going on. So, the middle class is rising everywhere in the world and it starts to challenge the status quo. They're not happy with the traditions that exist in Russia because it's still the aristocracy and the royals that have the preferential treatment in life. And now there's this new class that's formed and they want rights too. You also have them pushing for industrialization, which leads to urbanization. And like we talked about in class, and you guys will read about, it leads to like overcrowding in cities, dirty conditions, long work hours, dangerous working conditions, all of these really bad things. And so you're also going to have a rising working class that is just angry about how things work. So you have a middle class that's yelling that it's not fair that they don't have the same privileges as the other people. And then you have the working class mad because they live a very bleak existence in very rough circumstances. So what we'll talk about in our lecture tomorrow is going to be the isms, and like one of them is Marxism and socialism and communism. All of these are going to be a direct reaction, specifically in Russia, for these guys, um, about people being unhappy with the status quo and the social hierarchy in Russia. So there's going to be a lot of factors that go into it, and we'll talk about it more. But basically, all you have to know is, like we saw in Europe, there is instability in the social classes and people are upset, but Instead of there being a government in place where you can vote people in who might try to adjust things, you have a king still in charge and nobility. And those systems are just kind of archaic. So they've got to go. So when we look at how large the territory of Russia is, they're expansive to say the least. They're a large, dominating force in the world, which means it would be very hard for them to industrialize. Oh, excuse me, across the whole span of their country. It's costly. Also, that's a lot of places to try to get into this. So we start seeing people protest, especially during World War I. We see more of them. This is still before that moment. But look at that awesome, sweet dreadnought ship in the back. These are your iconic, industrialized, modernized weaponry for a navy. These big metal ships with so many guns on it. This is the kind of stuff that the rest of Europe specifically are just seeing how many of these they can make, in case there's ever a war, which just is leading to wanting to fight a war because you have all these stockpiles of weapons and stuff. So, when it comes to the revolution, if people aren't happy with circumstances and they decide to rebel, it's suppressed by the government. They shut it down very violently, but it's not like falling to deaf ears. You do have the czar make some changes that are supposed to be helpful. Creating a constitution, having political parties and trade unions to help for workers' rights. They have a national assembly called the Duma. Censorship isn't gotten rid of, but it's like toned down. And you have possibilities of universal education. So the czar is listening, but he's also not willing to give up his power and be like, let's have a democracy. It's what can I do to stay in power, but also like listen to the people and what they need. So I'll give him some credit. He definitely tries here. The problem is it didn't bring stability to Russia. People were still on strike. People were still in this state of unrest. And it all is going to culminate in 1917 with the Russian Revolution, which is outside of our time frame. That is a Unit 7 discussion. But all of this is just building to that moment where they decide they no longer want a czar. They no longer want to be this absolute monarchy. And they also don't really want democracy and capitalism. They have a new route to go. So the rise of communism marks the end of monarchy in Russia down the way. It's only in Russia where industrialization was associated with violent social revolution. We don't see it happening anywhere else. People are going to struggle socially, especially in the working class, but you don't see major revolts that lead to mass scale violence or government overthrows. That is a strictly Russia thing in history at this moment in time. So they're very unique in that aspect. So, what you guys are going to do next now is go to Classroom. Under where all of these videos have been posted, there's an article that's called Why Not China? Why the Industrial Revolution Didn't Happen There. And then there's a worksheet that goes along with it. So you can just split your screen and work on answering those questions, kind of analyzing more why this didn't happen in China when they are this powerhouse with a great population, with lots of stuff. And rivers and canals, like they should have been the one to industrialize. So the question is kind of just why weren't they? Why did other places beat them to it? When you're done with that, you can go work on your interactive notebook, reading, studying. You have a date quiz on Friday. You have your unit exam on Monday. Or if you're like, no, I'm good there, you can work on other homework you have for other classes. So, all right. Hopefully these were helpful.